Good afternoon. My name is Steve Schroeder with Rethink Loyalty for Bowling. We're showing you an exciting kind of a concept that we're launching in the bowling centers across the United States with the utilization of databases that is a growing concern amongst sponsors and business owners alike on how to utilize the data. We have our one of our partners, John Dodd, that will be walking us through this presentation. What we do is we will take your existing database. He will illustrate here what we do with that existing database, step 1, step 2, and we'll set up a whole system for you that we will kind of walk through fairly quickly here and show you how you can take advantage of the data, bringing a number of sponsorships, bring value to the data, add business synergy partners that will protect your price point so that you can charge full price, and we'll lay out that whole strategy to you. So why don't we have you take that away, Mr. Dodd?
Sure. Thanks for the kind introduction, Steve. This report that we're going to be showing here today it really has 3 parts. One is a waterfall report, and I'll come back to that in a moment. 2 is a heat map. I'll come back to that in a moment. And 3 is a set of bar charts, and you're going to see this pattern repeated on each of these bar charts. There's a red and black horizontal bar chart and a traffic signal colored vertical bar chart, each quantifying a different dimension of the customer profile. The horizontal bar chart looks at customer distribution, or what we call in statistical terms frequency. The vertical bar chart looks at market penetration index. So I'm going to go through each of those components here momentarily, and then I'll conclude with a look at what next steps might entail in the form of predictive modeling. So back to the beginning here. The first thing is the waterfall report. And all this does is it tells us what we did with the bowling customer database as we moved it through the model preparation. So in this example, we received a database of 1,146 bowling center customers. Now these were relatively incomplete addresses. There were some records that had name, address, city, state, zip, email, phone, etc., and some that had name only, others with name and email, others with name and phone. So we did what we could to create a database that had a full set of geographic attributes, that is a complete address, and that culminated in 286 actual bowling customers. Then we deduplicated that database to the household level, so where you had more than one member of the household in the same database, we ended up keeping just the head of household, because you don't want to double count households where you have more than one member, mainly because many of the demographics that we're going to use in the analysis are household level demographics, things like household income, length of residence, home ownership, etc. Then lastly, we matched those 212 actual bowling customers against a database of every consumer household in the U.S. that we maintain. It really has only names of adults in the household. We don't keep a database of children. And we got a 63% match rate, which culminated in a net clean, deduplicated, matched and appended bowling customer database, where we now have name, address, city, state, zip, age, income, wealth, ethnicity, length of residence, and many more attributes on a file that started out with a lot of incomplete records and is now full of beautiful, complete records.
Now, John, can I ask a question? Can I ask you a question about that before we leave the screen? So if we were to get better, cleaner records of the 1,146, which we can do by kind of mandating that they fill in their address, or a little bit more complete registration process. So if we do that, then do we end up with a better unique appended account because we gathered more accurate information at the beginning?
Yes, that is an accurate statement. That being said, if the more records, the better, right? So it's nice to have 100 records. It's better to have 1,000. It's better still to have 10,000. But we can build some really, really good models on 100 records. So here we had a modeling event group of 133 bowling customers. Then what we did is we pulled all non-customer prospects living in the same neighborhoods containing the 133 bowling customers. So this allows us to compare and contrast these two groups, essentially asking and answering the question, what makes these 133 bowling customers different from the 302,000 non-customer prospects living in the same neighborhoods? How are they similar and how are they different? Once we understand the major differences between these two groups, then that allows us to use that intelligence to go find prospects out of these 302,000 who most closely resemble these 133, and then serve advertisements to them through direct marketing channels such as direct mail, email, targeted digital display advertising, and so on, so that we cherry pick the prospects who most closely resemble the customers and thus have the highest likelihood of becoming new customers going forward. Now, we see that there were 302,000 prospects. Just to give you a sense of how that might shake out if we were to build a predictive model. First and foremost, we want to look at the geography just from a qualitative standpoint to make sure that we have that we're in the right neck of the woods here, right? So Revolution's Bowling Center is in Barstow, California, and so what we see here is that the customers are coming from that area. It's just more of a qualitative QA check, a nice to have, not necessarily a need to have. When we start drilling down into the actual underpinnings of the model, again, what you're going to see here is you're going to see this pattern repeated where there's a red and black horizontal bar chart and a traffic signal colored vertical bar chart on each of these slides. And each slide looks at a different attribute. So you look at household type, you look at age, you look at county. Now, I'm going to kind of skip county because basically 100% of the records are all coming from San Bernardino County. There's a handful that leak over into Riverside, but it's statistically insignificant. So let's look at age, for example. Now, what we see here with age, if you remove those where we didn't know the age, which often happens with, especially when you have kids, and we don't have kids in our database, what we see is kind of a bell-shaped curve, all right? But it's not really the typical bell-shaped curve. It's a little bit spiky here, and it drops off at the high end, all right? And one of the things that you see here is that the most populous category of the bowling customer, so the 103 bowling customer, 100 and what was it? Let me correct my numbers here. I think it was 133, but it might have been 103. It was 133, okay? So there was 133 bowling customers. Of those, right, they're illustrated here in this customer distribution or frequency chart by the red bars, and then the 302,000 record prospect universe by the black bars. And you can see here that the most populous category, where we know the age, is elderly, right? It's it makes up of just about 20% of the customers, but it also makes up just under 20% of the prospect universe. So there's no real prominent statistical distinction here, even though it's the most populous category. Same thing with 45 to 54-year-olds. It's the second most populous category by a very small margin, but it's neck and neck against the universe in terms of statistical discrimination. When we look at some of these younger age ranges, take the 25 to 34-year-olds, for example, they make up about 13% of the customers, but they make up only about 7% of that universe of non-customer prospects. Don't mistake the fact that the red bar exceeds its corresponding black bar for any given age range, in this case 25 to 34. Don't mistake that as market saturation. Remember, we're looking at 133 customers and 300,000 prospects. So we're a long way from market saturation. In fact, where you see the red bar exceeding its corresponding black bar, that actually represents a statistical sweet spot. And the way we quantify the magnitude of that sweet spot is we divide the customer percent by the universe percent, and we multiply by 100 to get an index. In this case, an index of 200. What that tells us in layman's terms is that customers of Revolution's Bowling Center in Barstow, California are roughly 2 times more likely than average to be 25 to 34 years old. So even though that age range only makes up about 13% of the customer population, it's a very important 13% because of the fact that they're twice as likely as average to fall in that age range. And they're 1.45 times more likely than average to fall in the age range of 35 to 44. So the real crown jewel of metrics in this report is the tall green bars. Where you see tall green bars, that is where we're asking and answering the question, what makes people who spend money at Revolution's Bowling Center different from people who don't spend money at Revolution's Bowling Center but who live in the same neighborhoods? And the mathematical indexes tell us the degree to which that dimension is true. So even though the most populous categories, and you don't want to discount them just because they're neck and neck against the universe, are 45 to 64, the greatest statistical distinction is happening here from 18 to 44.
Now, would this be especially true, John, with the lower amount of records? So, in other words, because we're only testing 133 actual clients against a universe of about 302,000 that are in her geographical footprint, this would really kind of give you a strong hint and say, holy smokes, if we're pulling in about twice as many 25 to 34-year-olds, that's our sweet spot. We really need to go after maybe 25 to 44-year-olds in a more aggressive manner because they're 2 or 1.5 times more likely to, be a customer of our center than the other universe. Is that correct?
That is correct. However, we're going to let the math do that for us when we get to the next step. We're not going to say, oh, go through and filter the universe and pull only people in that age range, because it may be that there's people in these age ranges where you only have moderate index values, but they have high index values in other areas. For example, maybe they are, you see here that you have a high index for nuclear families, mom, dad, and kids in the household, also a high frequency. So if they fall in that age range of 45 to 64, which we saw had moderate indexes but high frequencies, they would get a lower weight in the model, but they could very well be nuclear families with this high index here, or single dads, in which case then we would get, they would bubble to the top in the model. The nice thing about logistic regression is it's what we call a multivariate scoring methodology, and it never throws the baby out with the bathwater. Whereas if we just arbitrarily said, oh, we're going to go pull only people that are, 25 to 30 to 44 because of those high indexes, you'd be throwing out the baby with the bathwater in terms of these 45 to 64-year-olds that have high index values in other areas. Make sense?
Sure does.
Okay, so what we're seeing here again is, high index values on the low end of the age scale with moderate index values and high frequencies in the middle age ranges. We're seeing nuclear families and single dads popping in terms of indexing. And also to a lesser extent, these single moms, they're kind of neck and neck against the universe. So they're slightly, very slightly over-penetrating. Then when we look at it by gender, what we see is that it's the mom who's making the decision. Not by a giant index, but it's an index of 140 is, and this is a perfect example of why we would not throw the baby out with the bathwater and just lop all men off because they're under indexing, just because the mom's making the decision. If it's a man and it's a nuclear family and they're in the right age range, et cetera, they're still going to get a high score in the model. But we're seeing it skew high towards the mom with an index of 140.
Okay.
Then when we look at marital status, we're seeing that even though we had some single dads that were over-indexing, in general, marital status being married is over-indexing. By ethnicity, now here's an interesting dynamic, because what we see is Caucasian and Hispanic are the largest frequencies. They make up, together, they make up about 70% of, a little over, maybe 3/4 of the overall customer base is made up of Caucasian and Hispanic. But the highest index is for African American at 254. So even though it's only about 8% of the population of customers, they're still 2.5 times more likely than average to be paying customers of Revolution's Bowling. Now, one of the things we see here for household income is we see this kind of a double spike, what we call a bimodal distribution. Fancy way of saying that we see two major groupings of by income. One is toward the low end, makes up about 20%, and one is toward the high end, makes up a little over, almost a third, fall in this 50 to 75,000 plus. Even though the highest indexes are down here in these lower income groups, you've got your highest frequencies here in the middle to upper income groups. We look at it by wealth, and we see wealth sort of distributed in lockstep, where we break the population into 10% buckets, or what we call deciles, right? And you've got them ranked here 1 through 10, but you don't have any, there's not enough representation in the 10th decile of the most highly affluent people to even really register on the map. But your highest index, again, is down here toward the low end with a 231 index in the bottom 20% of the population by wealth. By education, we're seeing that they're largely high school educated, indexing at 142. By presence of children, we're seeing that 3/4 of them have kids in the house, and that they're 1.5 times more likely than average, with an index of 152, to have children in the home. When we're looking at number of children, more is better. We're seeing roughly 1/5 of the households have 4 or more children, and that they're indexing at 277. So once you get over 3, they're basically 2.5 to 3 times more likely than average to have 3+ children in the household. We look at length of residence. Even though we saw it skewing high by younger members, we're seeing the highest frequency and the highest index are amongst folks who've lived in their homes for 15 or more years, with about 1/3 of the customers falling in that length of residence bucket, and indexing at 137, or 1.4 times more likely than average to be in their homes for 15+ years. We look at home ownership status. We see that roughly 2/3 of the customers are owners of their own homes, but so is about 2/3 of the reference universe. So they're only over-indexing at 118. They're only indexing at 105. They're kind of neck and neck against the universe. They're actually slightly over-indexing for renting. The bottom line is home ownership is really kind of a non-factor in the model. We look at it by dwelling type, and we see it's kind of a non-factor also, because yes, 80% of them live in single-family dwelling units, but so does 80% of the reference universe, so they're only indexing at 108. Still important from a frequency standpoint, and it tells an important story, but from a statistical discrimination or, again, answering that question, what makes people who spend money at Revolution's Bowling Center different from people who don't? Dwelling type doesn't really help very much. We see a very high index for these affluent homes, but we see the highest frequency and the highest index in these more moderately priced homes. You have to take this grouping here, where it's the 600 to 650,000 in income, with a grain of salt because of the low frequency. When the frequency falls below 5%, you have to look at it a little bit selectively to make sure, we would test to make sure that it passes the test for statistical relevancy. The long and short of it is that more moderately priced homes are both the highest frequency and the highest index once you remove the statistical outliers. Now here's a very interesting statistic, is one of the attributes that our data compiling group adds into our database is direct mail responsiveness. And the way they get it is from co-op relationships with catalogers, magazine publishers, and nonprofit charities. So if somebody buys underwear from Victoria's Secret or a fleece jacket from trying to think of one of the
Macy's?
J.
No.
Crew. J.
Yeah,
Crew, that's who I was thinking of. They buy a jacket from J. Crew, or they buy a bra from Victoria's Secret, or they subscribe to Time Magazine or Sports Illustrated through the mail, or they donate money to American Humane Association or the Democratic Party through the mail. That pings our database. Where more than one direct mail transaction occurs, it pings it as a multiple direct mail responder. In your case, in the case of Revolution's Bowling Center, fully 60% of the customers are multiple direct mail responders. So not only is this a prominent statistical discriminator when you see that only 37% of the reference universe is a multiple direct mail responder and producing an index of 162, but it's also an implication that if Revolution's Bowling Center is not already using direct mail marketing as a significant contributor to its advertising channel mix, it ought to consider testing direct mail marketing as a contributing channel in its ad mix. When we look at charitable donor behavior, what we see that the categories that are most prominent are children's donors, both from a frequency and an index standpoint, and veterans donors, also both from a frequency and penetration index standpoint. So basically, customers of Revolution's Bowling are 2.5 times more likely than average to donate to children's causes and veterans causes, and religious causes, and also to just general philanthropic efforts. So despite the fact that they are of moderate wealth and moderate income, they're not moderate of heart when it comes to helping out the lesser advantaged folks. Interests and hobbies, they are pretty fully populated. When you see this kind of a distribution where all of the black bars and red bars are roughly the same shape and all of the indexes are about the same, it just means that it's a function of having a relatively finite population where we only had 133 customers, but there are many, many interest categories. So if you took one and moved it to another category, it's going to, significantly change that.
Now, before you leave this screen, I had a question for you, okay? Because obviously, what you just kind of mentioned was the more records we would have, the more likely statistical discrepancy we would have, both on the bars and on the, both on the left and the right side. Because we have such a few number, maybe that's why it's all even. But if we were interested in creating, let's say, partnerships or sponsorships on the Bowling Center, then as we build the database and garnish more statistically, relevant information, then we could kind of find out maybe, like if we had a heavy leaning towards investments for whatever, then maybe we could go approach, let's say, a Merrill Lynch or somebody in the neighborhood and say, hey, we just did a report on our database and we found out that our bowling centers are about 2.5 times more likely than the universe to want to have investments, and it's kind of a ripe spot for you, and then kind of negotiate or work on a special kind of a relationship with them where we could kind of go after them together in some form or fashion. Does that sound like an accurate, I mean, could we do something like that?
Yeah, no, that's very well said. The truth of it is, the more customers you acquire, the more refined we're going to get with the model. Really, the challenge when you have 133 customers in the model is not so much when it's things like gender or direct male responsiveness, where it's high, low, male, female. It's when you have 50 different interests, right? Or you're only seeing a dozen or so of them here, but we have many more. Or counties, right? There's 3,200 counties in the country, and so what happens is you divide 133 customers into 50 different interest categories, and it starts to become you start encountering sample size challenges, really only for those variables that have many value ranges within them, such as interests. But not necessarily. They're still useful, even if you can't use them in the predictive scoring model.
Okay, and if we wanted to expand the interest like you talk about, because you said there's about 50 of these we really could do if we wanted to, is that an option for a center as we grow their database? Or maybe we have 20, 10, 15, 20, 30,000 records. Can we expand the interest to find out where that sweet spot might be for sponsorships?
Well, you don't necessarily want to, and the reason for that is the populations are relatively moderately filled in our database. So we have some pretty esoteric interests. Do they smoke cigars, right? Or do they go to NASCAR races? Well, yeah, that's an interesting value, but it's only on 3% of the file. Out of 200 million consumers, 3% of them are flagged as cigar smokers. Is it useful for a bowling center to know that someone smokes cigars? Probably not. You kind of have to use some common sense on what you include. So we use what we call the usual suspects for these initial proofs of concept like this, just to try to flesh out what is most likely going to pop. And as you saw, yeah, interest didn't pop. There was only moderate index values, but we saw some real strong index values here for donor behavior and mail responsiveness and home value, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So just because you didn't get very good statistical significance or statistical discrimination for interests and hobbies across the usual suspects doesn't mean you should go add a bunch of NASCAR flags and cigar smoking flag mix.
Good, got it. Yeah, that's good point. Thank you.
Consumer vectors are sort of lifestyle clusters. They group people together based on where they are in life. This is one of those. There's, I think, 800 different categories here for consumer vectors. So once you get below the top 4 or 5, you fall below 5% frequency, which is the customer, which is the kind of the threshold for statistical relevancy. So they're kind of, this again is more of a nice to have than a need to have, where you see the highest index here of 993 is for suburban, Gen X, females, upper middle income couples with children. So they're nuclear families, the mom is driving the decision, they're young families, Gen X, they live in the suburbs, and they're upper middle income. All right, so this is kind of your statistical sweet spot. But again, with it being only 5% of 133 customers, if you added 5 more customers, it's going to jump above the highest frequency. So it's you have to take these with a grain of salt. And again, these would be more useful and more interesting once we start getting a bigger customer file.
Okay.
There's a descriptive slide that helps you understand what constitutes Gen X, etc. And then there's what we call a geovector, which has less granularity. There's only 108 of them instead of 800 because we've removed some of the dimension of it. It looks at it by urbanization, age, income, and family type. And what we see is they really are grouping into 2 age buckets: summer, which is 25 to 44, and autumn, which is 45 to 64. They're mostly middle income, some low income, and some high income. And there's a mix of families and singles, and all of them live in the suburbs. So where you see your highest indices are for 2123, which is suburban summer low-income families. And then the next index is 200 for 3123, which is suburban autumn low-income families. So this is telling us a little bit stronger story, and we're seeing greater frequencies, you know, or certainly more frequencies over that 5% threshold here for statistical relevancy.
Okay.
These again are more of a nice to have than a need to have. We will see them pop in some of the predictive models, but they're still useful from a descriptive statistics standpoint. So that's the end of the Revolutions Bowling Center customer profile model. If we were to take this to the next level and build a predictive scoring algorithm, we would take the most prominent characteristics and combine them into a logistic regression score, which is simply an algebraic equation that takes into account the most prominent characteristics and their corresponding mathematical weights. Now, this is a bit of an oversimplification because we know that in age you had 18 to 24, 25 to 34, 35 to 44, and so on. So when you see a mathematical weight of 0.44 or 0.43, that's really the average or the median value for all of the age ranges that fall within that variable. It's really more like if they're 25 to 34, then you probably multiply by 0.55. Or if they're 45 to 54, you might multiply by 0.40. Or if they're 18 to 24, you might multiply by 0.52. So pretty soon what you have is this algebraic equation that takes all of the value ranges within each variable and their corresponding mathematical coefficients, and it applies to the reference universe to enable us to identify prospects that most closely resemble customers of the bowling center. So if we depict that as a graph, right, we had, remember at the beginning, we had 302,000 prospects that fell within the zip code footprint containing the customers. And if we take that scoring algorithm that we developed based on age, etc., and we apply it to those 300,000 prospects and break it into 20 bucket 5%, where the highest scoring 5% are illustrated at the left end of the scale, the lowest scoring 5% are at the right end of the scale, and there are 18 other gradients of 5% in between. So the total is 100,000, so 10% would be 30,000. So each of these little buckets is 15,000. Here's your highest scoring 15,000. Here's your lowest scoring 15,000. Then what we do is we take those 133 actual customers of the bowling center and we blindly seed them in with that 300,000 record scored prospect universe during the scoring process. And we retroactively look to detect where they fall along the scoring scale after we've completed the scoring. So if the model's predicting what we set out for it to predict, that is propensity to become a new customer of Revolution's Bowling Center, we'd better see the highest aggregation of actual Revolution's Bowling Center customers falling towards the high end of the scale and falling apart towards the bottom end of the scoring scale, which we see here in this beautiful hockey stick shaped gains chart. Now, to measure the effectiveness of the model, we look to see how much taller each of these blue bars is in comparison to its corresponding red bar. And what we see at the high end of the scale is that this blue bar here is 7.7 times taller than this red bar. That tells us that if we target these 15,000 highest scoring prospects with our customer acquisition advertising message, they are 7.7 times or 7.8 times more likely than average, rounding up to 7.8, to become a customer of the bowling center. Now, that doesn't mean that we get a 780% lift in response performance where we were doing direct mail marketing and we got a 2% rate. Now we're looking to get a 16% rate. It typically translates to a lift of 20 to 40% over established baseline. So if you've been doing direct mail marketing for Revolution's Bowling Center and you've been getting, or email marketing or targeted digital display advertising, and you've been getting a 2% response rate or click-through rate or customer acquisition rate, you can expect to see that jump to somewhere between 2.4 and 2.8%. That is a 20 to 40% lift over that 2% baseline by targeting these lowest hanging fruit prospects with that customer acquisition advertising message. However, that being said, there is a second advantage besides the fact that you drive higher revenue by driving a higher advertising response rate. And that is this, right? If I take this bar chart and I plot it as a line graph, what you have is here on the vertical axis you have 133 customers, and here on the horizontal axis you have 302,000 prospects. If I take these 133 customers and I blindly seed them in with this 302,000 record scored prospect universe, if I don't have a model, I have to go knock on 302,000 doors to find all 133 of these customers. That's what the random red line illustrates. But by using the predictive model, as illustrated by this blue line, what I see is that I'm able to find about 80% of my actual paying customers of Revolution's Bowling Center in just the top 20% of that 300,000 record scored prospect universe, which allows me to remove from the advertising campaign all of these high-hanging fruit, low-propensity prospects that are unlikely to respond to my advertising message and become a new customer of Revolution's Bowling Center. So there's kind of a double advantage in that we're boosting revenues by elevating the response rate due to high precision statistical targeting, but we're also removing expense by avoiding wasting precious finite advertising dollars targeting prospects who are very unlikely to ever become customers of Revolution's Bowling.
Very nice.
So that's where we would go with the predictive model if we took this to the next level. That
Very good.
Brings me to a conclusion. Or do you have any questions for me in response to this today?
I would say no. Are you still there, Paula?
Yes, I am.
Okay, I'd be kind of interested to see what you thought about this, because I know a lot of bowling center owners and proprietors have never seen anything like this, right? They don't understand maybe how to gather the data properly, or who to go after to increase the frequency in their bowling center, or what kind of customers are their ideal customers, or how to craft a combination, a strategy, to even share advertising dollars or customer benefits. Would this kind of information help quite a bit had you, maybe started out from the very beginning understanding these kind of concepts?
Yes, absolutely. You know, just with any kind of generalized advertising, you're hitting the masses. But if you know that you can go for a specific age range, that would definitely bring it down as far as costs and affordability and target marketing.
Yeah, it seems rather kind of phenomenal to me. I look forward to helping the bowling centers get much more customers than 133, and then kind of comparing that, and seeing how that affects the eventual outcome. But as we can see, the data is very powerful. So we appreciate you showing us this, John, and look forward to bringing you more clients where we can really help them and move the needle a little bit.
Very good. Consider the door open anytime I can be of assistance. Do
All right.
you have any
Were
other
you gonna?
questions for me? I'm sorry,
No.
go
Were
ahead.
you gonna? No, I think that's it. Were you going to share one last thing in closing? Sorry, closing. Sorry, I cut you off there a bit.
No, I was just going to ask if you had any other questions for me before we conclude.
No, I think that's it. I mean, well, we can bring you the data via an Excel spreadsheet, a private FTP upload. I mean, you work with all the top companies with HIPAA compliance or anything, so they don't have to worry about their data or us stealing it in that faction, right? There's no fear there, correct?
No, we always execute a signed non-disclosure agreement and before transmitting data, and we basically it just says we will use it only for what you agree to let us use it for and nothing more, and then we'll destroy it at the end of the project.
Yeah, and that's called what? A mutual destruction agreement, I believe?
Affidavit of data destruction.
Oh, affidavit of data. Okay, so obviously the biggest companies kind of follow this profile. They trust your firm or firms with data like this, so there's no really reason why a bowling center should balk.
No, if JP Morgan Chase and Pilgrim Healthcare can send us their customers and patient data with account numbers and social security numbers, we can certainly take the data from Revolution's Bowling Center in a highly secure fashion.
Okay, very good. No, I think that's it. Did you have anything, Paula?
No, I'm amazed at the information. Thank you very much.
Glad to
Yeah,
do
thank
it.
you, John.
You guys have a great day, and I'll look forward to reconnecting with you soon.
Okay, take care.